Over this past year, we have been in a sermon series called The Plan. And in this series, we have looked at how God has worked through people and oftentimes despite people to work out his plan to ultimately bring redemption for his people. And today and then for the following 3 weeks, we're going to lean into one of my favorite stories in the Bible. We're going to dig into the book of Ruth. And as we've been studying and working our way through the Old Testament, I'm sure you've noticed that there is this greater story taking place, that something bigger is happening than just the specific people and the stories and the passages that we're studying. What we find is that as we study the Old Testament, there are themes and story arcs that repeat and weave through together, and they build upon each other, ultimately pointing to something that is greater and moving the story forward. Over and over again, we see people mess up and cause problems, and we see God work through those people and problems and past those people and problems to move his plan forward. And the book of Ruth is no different. In fact, it may actually be one of the clearest examples of this we find in Scripture. So my hope today is that you leave with a solid foundation and a clear understanding of what God is setting up through the story of Ruth, and that you leave encouraged by what God has done for you. So let's hop into Ruth chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And when they reached Moab, they settled there. Here we find the scene being set for the story that's about to unfold. We are told that this story is taking place in the time of Judges. If you've studied the book of Judges, you know that this story is taking place in a time when God's people weren't really following him. What the Bible tells us about this time is that in this time, people just simply did whatever they wanted. The book of Judges actually ends by saying, in those days, Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. Over and over again in the book of Judges, we see that God's people get involved and caught up in things that they never should have been. We see them reject God and anger him. Like in Judges 2, where it says, they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They went after other gods, worshiping the gods of the people around them, and they angered the Lord. It goes on in verse 17 to say, yet Israel did not listen to the judges, but prostituted themselves by worshiping other gods. How quickly they turned away from the path of their ancestors who had walked in obedience to the Lord's commands. This is a time period when God's people were not following him. And it is in this time period that we meet Elimelech, Naomi, and their sons. Now, to really understand what is being set up here, we need to look into the names of the people in this story. We have Elimelech, whose name means God is king, and Naomi, whose name means pleasant. These are great and very positive names, but what about the names of their children? Mahlon means sick or weak or sickly, and Chilion, his name means to waste, pining, and some would even say it means crybaby. We see that this older generation, their names are very positive, and together they point to the idea that when God is king, when we follow him, our outlook is bright, it is pleasant. But what we know about this story is that this is taking place in a time when God's people weren't following him. And this is reflected in the names of the next generation. It is a reflect in their outlook not being not so pleasant. The outlook of God's people has shifted, and this younger generation is marked by negative statements such as sickly and crybaby. God is reminding us that when he is our king, things go better for us. But when we reject him, things don't go well for us. We are told in verse 1 that there is a famine in the land, and this is incredibly significant as it gives an explanation for why Elimelech would leave Israel for Moab. But it also is pointing to the fact that this is a wicked and corrupt time in Israel. You see, Elimelech and his family are from Bethlehem, and the name Bethlehem means house of bread. And this is a really incredible name because it has both a literal meaning and it has a meaning that points to what God is ultimately working out. Bethlehem is called the house of bread because it was a region that was fertile and they were able to grow a lot of wheat. And subsequently, they had a lot of bread. This was a better off place to find yourself. And later in the book of Ruth, we are going to see the significance of the amount of wheat that is grown in Bethlehem. But not only does the name House of Bread have literal significance in that they had bread in Bethlehem, we know that down the road, Jesus would be born in Bethlehem. And Jesus is the bread of life. And when we celebrate communion, we are following Jesus' command to take the bread that represents his body being broken for us. So the house of bread, Bethlehem, is pointing to Jesus, even though this story takes place long before he is born. And we need to understand the significance of famine in the Bible. Famines were often God's way of getting his people's attention. It was a form of course correction for his children. We don't have time to get into all of this today, but understand that when God's people suffered famine, it was God saying, hey, you're being disobedient and your disobedience is going to lead to more suffering. But I have better for you if you just return to me. So in this story, we find Elimelech and his family in Bethlehem, the house of bread, where they should have had plenty, and yet they are suffering from famine. And so Elimelech looks across the Dead Sea into the country Moab and decided to take his family there because he believed it would be better there than in Israel. And to really understand the significance of Elimelech taking his family from Israel into Moab, we actually have to go back to Abraham and Lot. You see, Elimelech and his family are descendants of Abraham. They are Israelites. They are children of the covenant that God gave to Abraham. Remember, God said to Abraham, I will bless you and I will use you to bless others. I will protect you and your descendants, and those who oppose you, I will deal harshly with them. God promised to protect and to provide for Abraham and his descendants. We see him provide land for his people through the promised land. In fact, the story of Ruth takes place not too long after the story of Joshua and Jericho, where God told his people to walk around Jericho, and then God brought the walls down so that his people could inhabit the land. And in the story of Jericho, we learn about a woman named Rahab who was a prostitute, and Joshua had sent a couple spies into Jericho, and she decides to hide the spies and to protect them. And because of what she did, God actually spared her from the destruction of Jericho. Later, we learn that Rahab actually joins in with the people of God, even though she is not a descendant of Abraham. And what's really cool about Rahab is that someone we're going to meet later in this story is Boaz. And Boaz's mother was Rahab, which is just more foreshadowing that God is using to point to the greater thing that he is doing. So Elimelech and his family are very aware of the covenant that God had given them. He is very aware of the ways in the land that God has provided. And yet he decided to forsake what God had given and to pursue what looked better to him. So Elimelech takes his family to Moab. And Moab is a wicked place. The Moabites are descendants of Lot, and you'll remember Lot is the nephew of Abraham, and Lot had a lot of problems. He constantly kept walking away from what God wanted him to do. He would make bad decisions and cause a lot of problems. We know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where God actually sent angels to rescue Lot out of the city before bringing destruction. And it is after this happens that Lot's daughters are concerned about not having offspring. And so what they decide to do is to get their dad drunk, and they engage in a wicked act with him. And as a result, they become pregnant. One is pregnant with and gives birth to a son named Ben-Ami, whose descendants become the Ammonites. And the other gives birth to a son named Moab, whose descendants are the Moabites. You see, the Moabites were started out of sin. And they constantly opposed God and God's people. In fact, when the people of Israel were trying to get to the promised land, Moab refused to let them pass through their country. And whenever the people of Israel found themselves entangled with Moabites, they themselves would fall into sin. And eventually God becomes so angered by the Moabites that he says, no Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. It is safe to say God didn't want his people to be involved with the Moabites. And yet, Elimelech took his family to Moab. And things didn't go well. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. And this left Naomi alone without her 2 sons or her husband. Elimelech dies, and then his sons marry Moabite women, which is something God told them not to do. And about 10 years later, they die, and this leaves Naomi alone in a foreign land without her husband and without her sons. And you have to understand that this is the worst case scenario for Naomi. To be widowed in that day and age meant to have nothing. When a woman lost her husband, it was on her sons to protect and to care for her. But Naomi had also lost her sons. She had nothing, and there really isn't a system in place to take care of her. Now in Israel, there were some systems that would have provided something for her, but Naomi isn't in Israel, she's in Moab. And the people of Moab have no obligation, they have no commitment to care for her. So here's Naomi, alone in a land that is not her own. She's been abandoned except for the wives of her deceased sons. And Naomi becomes bitter. Later in chapter 1, we see Naomi say, "Don't call me Naomi," she responded. "Instead, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer, and the Almighty sent such tragedy upon me?" Remember, Naomi's name means pleasant. And here we see her say, "Call me Mara." Mara means bitter. Naomi is saying that she is no longer pleasant, but she is bitter. And she believes that God has dealt bitterly with her. And it makes sense. She's lost everything. She is in the lowest place that one could find themselves. But notice that even in her pain and in her suffering, she still acknowledges who God is. Even in her bitterness, notice that she still calls God Lord. Remember, names in this story are important. And what you and I read as the word Lord is the Hebrew word Yahweh. This is God's name. And in this name is the recognition that God is the creator. He is over everything. But even more than that, this is a recognition that this is God who entered covenant with Abraham. This is God who promised to protect and provide for Israel. This is the name that is written on the contract. You see, Naomi knows something that is incredibly important for us to understand. She understands that God is still God, even when bad things happen to us. Now, I'm sure every single person in this room has, at some point or another, experienced a bad thing happening to them. Maybe you've struggled with financial issues or lost someone you love. Maybe you've received a negative diagnosis or suffered some tragedy. Whatever it is, at some point or another, all of us will experience a bad thing happening to us. Now, sometimes the bad things that happen to us are consequences of our bad choices and our own decisions. Sometimes we are like Elimelech who chose to disobey God. And we go places and we do things that we shouldn't. And because of that, we often find ourselves in hard situations and we suffer as a result. Maybe you're here this morning and you look back on your life and you can see how the different missteps you made had led to brokenness in your life. Maybe you're here today and you recognize that you've not been living God's way and you're here trying to get things back on track. We all can recognize that our bad choices lead to bad consequences. Our poor decisions lead to poor outcomes. But God uses the consequences of our bad decisions to help us learn and to push us in the right direction. My son Ezra is 5, and often when we're out and about, I let him get a toy or a treat. And not too long ago, we were actually at a gas station, and they had this little toy on the shelf that he really wanted. Now, this toy was really cheaply made. It was cheaply made and overpriced, and it was just a piece of junk. And he really wanted it. Now, I have a special place of hatred for these types of toys because they always break and someone ends up crying and it's just not worth it. And so I saw an opportunity to teach my son a lesson about value. And so I said, hey, I know you want this toy, and yes, you can buy it, but later today we're going to go to Target. And if you choose not to get this toy, I will let you pick out a Lego set at Target. Now, Ezra loves Legos, and so I was sure that he would choose to get a Lego set versus getting this gas station toy. And you know what he picked? The gas station toy. And I really didn't want to buy this, so I doubled down. I said, hey, look, I know you really want this, but I think you should pick the Legos. And I think the Legos are so much a better option that I will actually let you buy 2 sets of Legos. Now, here I think I really got him because the obvious math is that 2 is better than 1. And so I'm thinking he's going to clearly pick 2 Lego sets. But he stands his ground. And he says, no, I want this toy. So we buy the toy. And later that day, we're at Target and we're going through our list. And I just hear Ezra say, hey, Daddy, you know how you said I could have 2 Lego sets if I didn't get the gas station toy? Well, I think I want to do that now. And so I'm faced with a decision. I can either be like the most fun person in the world and say, you know what? Yeah, you made a bad decision, but let's go ahead and get the Legos too. Or I can help my son learn that decisions have consequences. And so I say, no. I say, you made a choice and we're going to live with this choice. Do you know how he responded? He was not happy. I'm going to quote him. He said, you are a very, very mean daddy. He didn't like the consequence of his bad choice. But as his father, it is my job to help him learn to make good decisions. So I needed to let him experience some disappointment so that he might grow and make a better decision next time. Our choices have consequences, and God uses those consequences to help us realize the error in our decisions. But sometimes bad things just happen to us. And the reality is so much of life is outside of our control. There are tragic things that happen to people. And like Naomi, you may find yourself suffering, not as a consequences for something you've done, but because a bad thing just happened to you. You might find yourself sick or the victim of someone else's actions. You might have lost everything in an accident. I grew up in Joplin, Missouri, and in 2011, Joplin was hit by a huge tornado. And they actually just put out a Netflix documentary about this, and my wife and I sat down to watch it, and I couldn't get through half of it because the imagery just kept bringing up feelings and memories of witnessing the suffering and the loss. One of the memories that I will never forget is I was working with a cleanup crew in the days following the tornado, and we were turning a corner onto a street that cut all the way across town. And I remember as we were turning onto the street and we cleared the building that was there on the corner, I was just awestruck because I could see all the way across town, about 7 miles. And initially, I'm just overwhelmed at how far I can see and just how empty everything was. And then it started to click for me why it was that way. Because all the houses that normally obstructed my view were completely destroyed. Hundreds and hundreds of homes were completely demolished. Now there's something to think about with these homes being demolished is that some of these homes did belong to bad people. People who in our human sense of justice, we might say they had it coming. People who were involved in horrible things and we might think they deserve some suffering or calamity. But the reality is that most of those homes belonged to good people who didn't deserve it. And it's not like there's something they could have done to have that not have happened to them. There's no way to tornado-proof your house except for living completely underground. And it's not like the natural consequence for somebody's actions is to have an EF4 tornado rip through your house. And yet it still happened to them. Sometimes we are like Elimelech, and our bad choices have bad consequences. And sometimes we are like Naomi, and bad things just happen to us. And yes, there are consequences for our bad choices. And yes, bad things can just happen to us. But regardless of how we find ourselves in that hard place, the reality is that God is in control and is still working out his plan. You know how sports coaches often just get stuck on that one idea or that one value, that one quote. I had a basketball coach when I was younger who he had this saying, and he said it every practice, he said it every game, and he would say, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond. Now, usually he was telling us that because we were losing in a game and he wanted us to just keep playing hard. I really think he was saying it to me so that I would keep working hard even though everyone else was way better than me. But the reason that sentiment resonated was because it is rooted in truth. You are not in control of what happens to you. You are in control of how you respond. Now, when Now, it wasn't Naomi's fault that her husband died. It wasn't her fault her children died. It wasn't even her fault that she was in Moab. Elimelech made that decision. It would have been really easy for Naomi to reject God, to say, I can't believe in a God who would let this happen to me. How easy is it for us to reject God because he doesn't do what we want? How often do we see people walk away from the faith because God isn't who they think he should be, or he doesn't do what they think he should do? How many times have we seen people say that they can't believe in a God who lets bad things happen? Naomi could have completely walked away from God. She could have completely turned her back on him. But even in her suffering, even though she is angry and bitter, she still recognizes that God is Lord. This is probably why she's bitter. She knows who God is. She knows that he is all powerful. She knows that he is over everything. She knows that he could have kept her husband and her sons from dying, but he didn't. When God doesn't do what we want, or when he allows us to endure hard things, it is easy for us to walk away from God. We all probably know someone who has walked away from God, rejected him, even denied his existence because they cannot accept that God would allow suffering. And so what we often find are people who deny that God exists, yet are still angry at him. Because deep down, we know the truth is that it's not that God isn't real. It's not that he doesn't exist. He's not who you think he should be. He is not a God that you can control. He is not a God made in your image. You cannot hate who you don't believe exists. The reality is it doesn't matter how you feel towards God. You cannot make him not be God because he is God and you are not. And so even though Naomi is bitter, she still recognizes who God is. And God remains faithful to Naomi. You know, this morning we focused a lot on Elimelech and Naomi and their sons, but the truth is the star of the story is Ruth. And it makes sense, the book is named after her. Ruth is one of Naomi's daughters-in-law, and really all we know about Ruth up to this point is that she is a Moabite and she is now widowed. Orpah and Ruth, having married into Naomi's family, are now in a sense stuck with her. And Naomi hears that things are improving in Bethlehem, and so she decides to return there. But on the way, she decides that it would actually be better for Orpah and Naomi to return to Moab to be with their families. But on the way, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back to your mother's homes, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage." And then she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down and wept. Eventually, Orpah listens to Naomi, and she returns home. But Ruth doesn't. Ruth clings to Naomi. And what she says in this moment is one of the most powerful declarations of love and loyalty that we find in Scripture. She says, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." You see, God is faithful to Naomi through Ruth. God was faithful to Naomi, not by removing her suffering, but by sending Ruth to walk through it with her. Elimelech made a bad decision to go to Moab. He messed up, but God fixed his mess up by returning Naomi and Ruth to Bethlehem. Naomi had experienced a horrible loss, but God used Ruth to care for and support Naomi in her suffering. If you're here today and you relate to Elimelech, you realize you've made bad decisions, you've walked away from what God has called you to, and you think you've messed everything up, hear me say this: you cannot stop God from fulfilling his plan, because his plan is bigger than you. And there is no mistake, there's no problem you can create that he cannot fix. The truth is, God doesn't need you to even fix your mistakes, because he can. And when we mess up, it is so easy for us to believe that it is up to us to fix everything. But the reality is, we can't fix everything. There are just some things that we are not capable of fixing. Now, I'm all for personal responsibility and for owning your mistakes and working to fix the things we break. It is good to admit when we mess up. It is good to ask for forgiveness. It is good to improve yourself. It is good to reconcile with others. But the reality is, we can't fix all of the things that we break. And when we think that it is up to us to fix the things that we just cannot, we find ourselves in a place of despair. But God can fix what you break. And he doesn't even need you to do it. You see, Elimelech made a bad decision. He messed up. He took his family to Moab, a place they never should have been. And his actions had bad consequences. His actions negatively impacted Naomi. But in this story, Elimelech dies and he doesn't fix his problems. But God uses Ruth to fix what Elimelech broke. And so if you're here today and you are overwhelmed by the reality that you have broken things that you cannot fix, you are wrapped in guilt and shame, you find yourself in a place of despair, surrender those things to God and watch him work them out. Maybe you're here today and this morning, you are like Naomi. You are hurting. You have suffered and you find yourself struggling. Maybe a bad thing has happened to you. Listen, God has not abandoned you. He's not punishing you. He doesn't hate you. He loves you. And he is going to use the hard thing you are facing now for good. He will use what you are dealing with now to bless others and to build up your faith. Not too long ago, we looked at the life of Joseph, and Joseph suffered bad things happening to him. You see, his brothers sold him into slavery, and through that process, God ultimately brings Joseph to a place where Joseph is now in power and authority over his brothers. And he says this to them: "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." You see, God used Joseph to save many people from famine. And he used the bad things that happened to Joseph to get him there. God used the bad things that happened to Joseph to bless others. And Joseph could have been angry at God for allowing him to suffer the way that he did, but instead he allowed God to work in him and through him, and he found himself in this place to help others. And Joseph grows in his faith to the point where he can recognize and declare that God was using the bad things that happened to him to work out the greater plan that God was working. Joseph's outlook is what we see in James chapter 1, where it says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." God uses the hard things we face to help us grow. He uses the challenges we face to build up our faith. So as we go through trials, look and see how God is working in you and building you up so that your faith might be a testament to those around you. And if you're in a place of suffering and sorrow this morning, give it to God. He will use it for good. He will use it to build your faith. He will use it for something bigger than what you are dealing with now. You see, God used the hard thing that Naomi experienced. He used her suffering for good. He used her pain and the bad things that happened to her for something bigger than her. God used Naomi's suffering to get Ruth to Israel. And God is going to use Ruth in an awesome way. You see, Ruth, the Moabite, will eventually become the great-grandmother of King David. And it is through David's line that Jesus would be born. Jesus, the Redeemer of the world. You see, your mistakes are not too big for God to fix. And your problems are not too big for God to handle. If it wasn't for what Naomi experienced, if it wasn't for Elimelech's bad decision to take his family to Moab, Ruth wouldn't have been with Naomi. Ruth wouldn't have been in the place that she needed to be to stand by Naomi and to go to Bethlehem. Without the bad things that happened to Naomi, Ruth wouldn't have been in the place that she needed to be to show us what it looks like to demonstrate sacrificial love and to stand by somebody in their suffering. What Ruth does is not just loyal, it is sacrificial. It was costly for her. It was a complete reversal of position. You see, Ruth took Naomi's place. Naomi was a widow in a foreign land. She had lost her husband, lost her sons, and she had no support in Moab. But when Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem, Ruth insists on going with her, even though it means becoming exactly what Naomi was. Ruth willingly trades places with Naomi. See, Naomi had been a foreigner in Moab. Now Ruth would be a foreigner in Israel. Naomi had been a widow in a strange land, and now Ruth would be a widow in a land that despised Moabites. Ruth was essentially giving up her future. In Israel, Moabites were hated and excluded. Ruth was walking into a place where no one would welcome her. No one would trust her. She was trading her safety and security for shame. She was trading her comfort for loneliness. She was stepping into rejection, also that Naomi wouldn't be alone. And this stunning act of love is a powerful foreshadowing of what Jesus did for us. You see, Jesus took our place. Like Ruth, Jesus stepped into our suffering. Like Ruth, Jesus became an outsider. Like Ruth, Jesus bore shame that wasn't his to bear. But unlike Ruth, Jesus didn't just share in our suffering. Jesus took upon himself the full weight of our guilt and our shame. 2 Corinthians says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus didn't just leave heaven to come and visit us. He came to rescue us from our sin. He came and lived in a world that rejected and despised him, also that one day we might be welcomed into his kingdom. And just like how Ruth took Naomi's place in exile, Jesus took our place on the cross. And it is because of his sacrifice that we can now live in him. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. What we broke, Jesus fixed. Where we hurt, Jesus brings healing. When we take communion, we're remembering the moment that Jesus traded places with us. The bread represents his body that was broken for us. The cup represents his blood poured out on our behalf. It is a reminder that we were once far from God. We were broken and we were bitter. We were caught up in our sin. We couldn't have saved ourselves. There's nothing we could have done to have earned our place back with the Father. And yet Jesus looks at us and says, I will take their place. You see, Jesus came down and he left heaven and he became a man. He lived a life that we never could have lived. He died a death that we deserved to die. He took our place. He became an outcast so that we might be brought in. He was broken so that we might be healed. He was rejected so that we might be accepted. And that's what we're remembering today.